Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Astera, and you are listening to the next episode of the Love Talks. Our podcast is about marriages, relationships, dating, and other life topics. And my co-host Ashish Parekh and I invite different guests who can contribute to those topics and tell their stories to you and to us. Today, we will be talking about cross-cultural relationships and marriages. And also another topic which is intertwined with that would be interfaith marriages. So stay tuned. And our today guest is Melanie Goel from Germany. Hello, Melanie.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's really great to have you here and listen to your story and your perspective on your cross-cultural and interfaith marriage. I have some perspective on that too, as I was in a relationship for 7 years that my partner was from a different country and also of different faith, though in our case it wasn't such a big difference. But anyhow, it's really great to have you here because I know that your husband comes from a completely different culture than you come from. And well, that's something that is probably very much more complex than my experience. And that's why it's great to have you here and talk a bit about it. Well, these days, cross-cultural marriages or relationships are not really that uncommon. And well, they were not really that uncommon even 30 years ago, they were still happening. But I guess because of the globalization and at least in the pre-COVID era, the possibilities and the opportunities to change countries, for example, for career opportunities, or even just if someone wanted to change the environment, and live in a different country for a while, they were quite, well, endless. So cross-cultural marriages and relationships, they have become in the last 10, 15 years much more common than they were before, right?
Absolutely. I think in our friend circle, I would say about 65% are intercultural couples, not a lot that have Asian and European, like that where the intercultural is Asian and European. But like, for example, North American, European, we have a lot. We also have Middle Eastern European. So it's really interesting because everyone brings like such different experiences to every meeting that we have or whenever we hang out with them. So it's pretty fun, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you said, if both partners or both spouses are from more or less the same cultural background, like from different countries in Europe, which was in my case, then there is some diversity, of course, but that's in some way it is, limited. But as you said, yeah, your husband, he's Asian, right? He's from
Exactly.
India.
Yeah.
So your marriage is very cross-cultural, and it also comes with interfaith.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 So
He's from New Delhi, in India. He came to Germany for his master's. That's where we met. We were both working students at a small company. It was actually only him and me, so that's how it was very easy to cross paths. But yeah, it was probably the last thing that I expected because I studied Chinese. I thought if I have an Asian, it's probably going to be a Chinese man and not from India. But so that was pretty fun. Yeah.
yeah, life gets funny sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
Unpredictable.
This was the last thing that I was expecting.
Well, that happens. We can't really control everything, right? And
Yeah.
definitely we can't control love. But tell me how it is to have a partner from a completely different culture than your own. How is your daily experience of that?
Yeah, actually, it's probably different from person to person. I think we were quite lucky that we, like, even our friends and our families, they always say that my husband, he's more German than me and I'm more Indian than him. So I'm a bit messy. I'm more of the unorganized person. I like it.
Yeah, that's not very German.
No, it's not German. Like whenever we arrive in Delhi at the airport, it feels like, chains fall off of my arms and legs because I don't have to be so organized, like the environment that I grew up in. And for him, he loves organizing absolutely everything. So,
Oh, okay, okay.
so in that way, I think it wasn't that big of a deal. I think what is challenging sometimes, which might be a bit less if you are, or which is a little bit less also from my experience with partners who were German, is that if you are uneasy with something in the other culture, you really have to find a way of framing yourself, like framing your thoughts in a way that's not hurting the other person. You don't want to hurt them or just say bluntly, like, your culture is stupid, or why are the people in your culture doing this?
Exactly.
It's like a condescending way, which I guess is something I've seen a lot in Asian European relationships. So that like a European person would take a more condescending view, which is stupid because there's nothing better or less good, right? So it's totally
Exactly.
equal.
It's just different.
It's just different, exactly. And I think this is one of the challenges that, at least in the beginning, when you're kind of getting accustomed,
Mm.
that is one of the things. In general, I think when I just talk about Sid and me, I guess the only cultural challenge, honestly, that we had was I grew up on the countryside and he grew up in a metropolis. Like he grew up
Right.
in the center of New Delhi. And we grew up with different worldviews. We grew up with just a different environment. I see the advantages of the countryside and he doesn't know it. He sees the advantages of the city that I know a little bit less about. And so for us, the biggest challenge was finding a place where both of us could feel home.
Hmm. So it
And
wasn't that much about the culture, because that can also happen for partners from the same country, right?
exactly, like that's what we always say. Like we think the only cultural difference is really about the place we were brought up, like urban versus rural. And I think it not so much with the actual world, like the cultural environment that we're growing up in.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what would you say like about any other challenges that you had in your marriage or before you got married? Was there anything else that you had to deal with?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that is probably very particular to Indian relationship is that parents usually don't know. Like in India, you usually get married, you don't necessarily have a girlfriend. I think this is also
Hmm.
changing a lot in the
Yeah,
current.
the arranged marriages.
So you have, on the one hand, you have arranged marriages, but you also have a lot of love marriages now. I think also you have, it's changing with our generation that people tell their parents that they have a girlfriend, but it's not that common. It's not that common. My husband is very, he thinks really highly of his parents and he never wanted to hurt them or pry with anything that was not 100% solid.
Mm.
So I think one of the challenges is that they didn't know for a very long time that I was existing. And for me, I'm a family person, and I just like here it's normal that you introduce your partner, you want them to be a part of your family, and I always wanted to be a part of his family,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't be for a long time. So this was something that obviously we had some challenges with, because I always said, like, why can't I be part of your family? They're going to like me. Believe me.
Yeah, that's what we think here in Europe, right? Or in the Western world, because we don't
Yeah.
really know the culture. But
Yeah.
well, I mean, yeah, what you said is quite usual to say actually for Indian people or Indian men, because among my friends, I've also heard that they never want to in any way offend their parents, and sometimes while having a girlfriend from a completely different part of the world can be just simply offending in some families. That's not that uncommon. For how long were you that secret girlfriend?
Yeah, I think I was kept secret for 1.5 years.
Okay,
Um,
that's not that long.
yeah, for me, it felt like 10
Yeah,
years.
yeah. Yeah, of course, because
Yeah.
here, as you said, we rather just introduce our partners, even if we are not married. Of course,
Yeah.
maybe not every random person that you meet somewhere, or maybe you have a date with, but if you are with someone for a couple of months, then it's quite natural, even bring them home, or maybe even for bigger celebrations like Christmas or something, if you are together for a bit longer. So yeah, I guess that must have been quite a big challenge. And but what did you do with that in the end? Because as you said, for 1 year and a half you were a secret girlfriend, but then I guess somehow you had to tell the parents.
Yeah, it was really so I still feel a little bit bad about this. I put a lot of pressure on my husband. I was
Okay.
always worried that he would go home and they would find someone for him. Like he already told me that his parents aren't like that. They wouldn't just find someone for him. But I somehow couldn't believe it because I haven't been in India before. I didn't know anything about India apart from what I knew about him. And he is extremely liberal. So I didn't know really what to expect. And so I put quite a lot of pressure on him, to be
Mhm.
honest. And yeah, at some point, like I was in China. And when I came back, we decided to move in together because he was done with his master's. And he knew that when we move in, he kind of has to tell his parents, at least that he has a girlfriend. But what he did then in the end, he called them and said, okay, by the way, I have a German girlfriend and we live together.
Okay. So
um,
so he
it,
just threw that
he threw
information.
everything at them. They honestly, they never had a problem that I was German. He told them how I adopt the culture, and that's really everything they wanted. So we are extremely blessed that he has liberal parents and I have liberal parents in law. But obviously, they were not confident with us living together. So
Mm.
actually, what happened, he anyway had a flight to go back home a few days after that. And then he went home for 2 weeks and they saw me on Skype and they saw how happy he is. And then they said, in the end, what matters is that you're happy, even if you're not 100% convinced or not convinced, but not 100% on board with the living together situation.
Mm.
But he also explained, like, in a city like Munich, you cannot really afford having two apartments.
Mm. So you
Yeah,
just
but
use this economic factor as an
yeah,
argument to convince his parents.
yeah. Yeah, but in the end, they really wanted him to be happy. But we also like to be very blunt and honest. We talk about this a lot also with other friends. We might be lucky because he's a man, because he's a boy, and it might be different. I don't know. I know a few people where it's difficult because she is Indian and the guy is European, that there's a little bit less they are a little bit less understanding in that case. I don't want to generalize it because I'm sure that there's both cases, but this is something that we think we're quite lucky actually.
Hmm. I think that there may be something in it because even recently, when I was talking with one of my Indian friends who is a man, he said that he thinks that if it is a couple in which the woman is Indian and the guy is European, they could actually have much more of hard time with the parents of the girl. But I think, as you said, it's a pretty individual case because I remember working in one of my previous jobs, and I had a colleague, and she was Indian, and she had a German husband, and it didn't seem to be a problem for anyone. I think not for their families either. But then, you hear sometimes from my more distant friends here in the UK that there are some cases that like British Indian who are already maybe born here or who came here as little children and were brought up in this Western culture. But it happens that when they actually start having a girlfriend who is British or some other European, then parents start looking for a wife for them, even in India. So
Mm.
sometimes you hear about that cases. So I understand that you were pretty anxious for some time that something like that could happen.
Yeah, totally. And it's really like in the beginning, you're so blind because everything is beautiful and you're so in love that you love everything. But then you hear stories and then you get more and more insecure. Like, how does this all play out? Like, and I think we were very comfortable because he always consulted me also. And he said, you don't have to be worried. I have very liberal parents and it's not going to be a problem that you're German. They didn't expect it. So they never expected him to meet someone German. They expected him to meet an Indian girl in Germany, but not a German. But it hasn't been a problem. So this is, I think that's really great. But still, I think it's still, even though it's not a problem, you still, like, when families come together, you have to accommodate a lot of, you have to accommodate each other because, again, our parents are from different generations. And even though my parents are liberal and his parents are liberal, like, our parents actually get along really well. So that's really nice. Even though my parents don't speak English, his parents don't speak that much English. So they speak in sign languages, but they're very cute together and they like each other. So that's great. But you grow up in very different style, which also makes sense because in a city like New Delhi, you would be way more protected. It's obvious, right? In such a big city. And then growing up on the countryside somewhere south of Munich, whereas you have cows and that's it, you're obviously not that protected because, what would happen?
It's a different lifestyle in general.
Exactly. So if you then have everyone cramped into like one apartment for a longer time, so you definitely need to, like, not just on my side, I don't want to blame anyone, right? But I think there's a lot of patience and the willingness to understand how the other person thinks. And I think that is one of the crucial things in an intercultural marriage, that you don't blame, but rather take the time and the patience to breathe and then think, okay, let me just understand this first. And maybe then I get why they are reacting like this or why they are saying like this. They know that I love them and I know that they love me. So it's not that issue. So it's more on a cultural or communication basis if you notice that something is not going the way that it should be.
Yeah, it's always about being open and also have this kind of a mindset that allows you to interact with people who have a completely different background, cultural or even sometimes social, because that's not only about different cultures. Being open to other people and trying to understand their reactions, that's, in every marriage is quite important, but cross-cultural one, it can be even more important. You finally got married, and how would you say the attitude of his parents has changed since then? Or is it the same? Was it like quite good before the marriage, so you didn't see any changes?
No, I think it has changed. So in India, it's the same. You are really introduced into the family. So I'm their daughter. They call me their daughter, and so that's really nice. The longer we are now married for 5 years, and we're partners since 8 years, 8.5 years actually. And so that's one of the things, for example, that I feel Western culture should learn from the Indian culture again is, if there is a matter in the family, then sort of everyone sits together and discusses and talks about it. And there's not so much talking behind the back, but you really, like, the parents, they console the children and ask, how should we approach this? How should we do this? So, and that's something I really enjoy. That's really nice. Yeah. And so this is also something that I've noticed where I have a voice now, where I can also voice my opinion. But I think this is also one of the very interesting things that I've noticed, which I never thought about, which is a cultural difference where you have to be quite careful. And that is the mimic and the gestures. They are so different in different cultures. So, for example, I always want to then smile and do something to kind of acknowledge that, yes, I'm on board, and someone else might react in a different way, but saying the same thing. And then you're just interpreting something and you think like, oh, why is this person now grumpy? And I mean, or something like that. So that's something that I found really interesting, to be very careful about this interpreting.
Yeah, that's true, because we use our own cultural framework to
Yeah,
interpret whatever we see or hear. And that's not exactly how it should be done, because
yeah,
that's, as you said, gestures are different. People behave differently in different cultures when they want
yeah.
to
And
to
facial expressions, this
yeah.
is really something that I've noticed is especially different between Indian and German culture. Like I've spent a lot of time in Canada, I've spent a lot of time in China, and nowhere have I experienced so much talking through facial expressions like in India.
Oh.
And that is something that I've noticed I have to be careful about, that I don't interpret something because I don't really know what they're actually saying. So, in finding
What
out.
was the most sort of shocking or unexpected thing with facial expressions that you've noticed?
So, I think maybe it's also my family, but in general, I think if we get something gifted or when we are happy, then we show in a very enthusiastic way in our face that we are appreciating
Mhm.
this. And I think in India, it's just a bit toned down. And that
Okay.
doesn't mean that there's less appreciation, not at all, like not at all. But it's just showed in a different. I remember also people who visited me. Like I lived in India for 5 months. My husband was here, but in Germany, but I was over there. And when friends visited me, they thought, why are they angry? And like in a situation where we thought, and it was actually not like that.
Mm.
That was one of the things. But I also hear people who come to Germany and then say, why are they all angry? So
Ah,
maybe
yeah,
that's like
yeah.
a universal thing.
But that's quite a universal thing for some cultures, even in Europe, because I spent 7 years in Finland, and the culture there is different. People are much more toned in a way. They don't really show that much of happy emotions, which doesn't
Yeah.
mean that they are not happy, but they look more neutral, or some even maybe grumpy. And that was also quite interesting for me, because I come from Poland and we are quite expressive there. But that's not even in relationships. That's the kind of things you have to be quite aware, even in, well, business, general life, when you move to a different culture. What would you say about having different faiths in a relationship? Because I remember that we spoke before, and you mentioned something that you had two different weddings. So how that kind of things work out? Because I think that there is quite a big difference between you and your husband in terms of religions. I personally don't have that experience, because my partner was Christian as well, just of a different denomination. But
Mm.
how did you sort out the faith issue?
I think, again, we were probably quite lucky because I'm not particularly religious. And my husband, he is more on the spiritual end of Hinduism. So he's not praying every day, but he's very much into the spiritual, like not the spirituality that we understand now, but he just wants to understand about Hinduism as a religion. So he reads a lot about the gods and things like that to understand how that spirituality kind of started in India. I think from the beginning onwards, for us, it was important to make sure that if we have children, they get exposed to both religions, but have the ability to reflect on both of them. We want to make sure that we don't put a label on them, but that they decide what do we find interesting here. And we approach the same thing, for example, with our weddings. So when we did our weddings, we thought, okay, we don't want to upset anyone, like neither his family nor mine. So we did a legal wedding in Germany without church, because for his family would have been extremely uncomfortable to see their son walk down an aisle. So we didn't want that. We didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. And at the Indian wedding, we did the same thing. So we did the fire, so walking around the fire, but we did not do all the other religious ceremonies that usually come before that part,
Hmm.
simply because that would have been very uncomfortable to my parents. However, what we are trying to do is that we adopt, for example, there's Diwali, there are these the big and important
major festivals.
exactly. And we do say that we want to make sure that we have the knowledge about these festivities and also the rituals that happen on them so that we can at least let our kids experience what this culture means, what these festivities mean to the culture. I think we're approaching it from that perspective. We are both people who are questioning a lot, and that's kind of where we're coming from.
Yeah, I think that this topic of having different cultural background and also different faiths, different beliefs is pretty much comes to the surface when people have kids, because I remember one conversation that I had when I was doing my PhD in Finland, because that one of the professors there, who was my supervisor during my master's, she had a different religious background. She was Jewish, but born and raised in Finland. And my supervisor at that time of my doctoral thesis, she was living in Finland, but she was born in the Soviet Union, but she had some Finnish backgrounds. And these two women, they had a conversation about how it is to be cultural and how it is to have the kids, and which culture actually you would, sort of not impose, but you would prefer your children to follow. And the clue was that, well, you are actually bicultural until you have children, because when you have children, then you always have the preference for your own culture. I hope it doesn't work like that to you and your husband, but I remember that conversation, and it really made me think about those things, because this is pretty much how it is. Everyone would like their child to be following what they believe in. So I guess that gets complicated then. But what about your daily life? Do you find it in any way more difficult when compared to, for example, your friends that have German husbands and wives, or do you think there is no difference in daily life?
I think in the daily life, not. Because I truly believe I'm just lucky, but I truly believe that it's like the person that I fell in love with, and we are just very compatible, and the culture is not really a topic in our daily life. So in the beginning it was, yeah, because like Germans are known for being extremely straightforward. I always told him like right straight to his face if I was not happy with something. And obviously sometimes he had to like, what the hell, like what does she think she's doing here? And Indians are much more composed and much more gentle in the way they give feedback and the way they speak to other people than necessarily we Germans. So I think in the beginning, that was the biggest challenge in our day-to-day life, that I kind of had to tone down. I had to understand that I have to accommodate the way that he is also. The thing, especially I think in Germany, when we criticize, we don't criticize the person, we criticize the activity or the outcome or whatever the person
The
did.
behavior.
Yeah, so we kind of differentiate in that, but not a lot of other cultures do that. So I had to kind of understand that I have to accommodate the way I speak, because I didn't want him to be hurt, right, in the end. So this was something that really was difficult in the day-to-day life, and I think it probably took about 3 years until we really got that figured out and we were on a good track there. Other than that, I mean, obviously, since we do live in Germany, he is homesick. So we try to bring some Indianness into our daily life. So I really like the example that you just gave, because I think for us, it's a little bit different, because I always tell him, if we have a kid, I want to make sure it gets exposed to Indian culture, because we're in Germany. So I want to make sure that this kid, that we don't go to India for the first time and has like this massive culture shock. Maybe it's different when the kid is there, but
Yeah, but I think that these days it's anyhow quite well. It's easier than it used to be 30 years ago, for example. If you
for sure.
live in a completely different country, because you still can, show different things to the kid even on YouTube, right? And 30, 40 years ago, cross-cultural couples didn't really have that chance. You had to physically travel somewhere. And as you said, that was the first shock that was coming
Yeah.
with that kind of experience. But what would you say was like the biggest challenge of your whole relationship? Well, before you were married and since you are married, what would be that major challenge that you had to do something about and overcome?
I think the absolute major challenge really was that I had to be hidden for such a long time. Because even when we got married in Germany, people were not allowed to know in India. So we had to tell everyone at our wedding, don't post any photos on social media where both of us are on the
Okay.
picture. So then there were photos of me and my cousin or me and a friend, and people asked me, "Oh, wow, did you marry this one? What happened to Sid?" And, things like that. And that was really painful, especially once we were married. And before we were married, we were not allowed to go to India together. He was not allowed to visit me. So this was really painful. I don't think it was problematic that we got married so early, but I'm pretty sure we would have waited. If it wasn't for that, because we just wanted to put an end to this.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to put an end to it. We wanted to travel to India together. We wanted to do all these things. We didn't want to tell our friends to hide us anywhere in social media or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think this really was a big challenge, especially like after a wedding, you're on like your cloud number 9 and everything is so awesome. And then you hear, no, you have to tell your friends to put down the pictures on Facebook, and you think like, what? Like, we're married now. Like, isn't
Yeah, I
is it
mean,
over now? But
exactly. I wanted to ask about it because, well, I'm not that familiar with the Indian culture. So why was it that you still couldn't say to anyone, like officially, that you are married, although you had married? Uh,
we had to wait until the Indian wedding,
okay,
because
so
if people in India would have known that we got married in Germany, people would have been offended that they
okay,
weren't
so it was
invited.
more
So
about not offending. Okay,
yeah. So
okay.
yeah, and obviously, like, we couldn't do that. We were
Mm,
28. We couldn't afford accommodating so many people for food and everything. Like, we
yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
have
of
paid for
course.
that. That was kind of the reason.
Okay.
And but I think probably, like, in India, we're still lucky. I have friends who are Iranian, and I think there it's even crazier. If someone distant friend of a relative is not invited to the wedding, then there's like a huge
Okay, yeah,
mayhem.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, in that sense, we were still lucky.
Mm-hmm.
I really think this was the biggest challenge that went on for 4 years, and
Mm, quite a
that
long
I always said, I just want to be part of your family now. I want
time.
to move freely with you, and I want you to be able to visit me when I'm abroad. And during that, I was abroad almost 2.5 years before we got married, and he never was allowed to visit me. And
Okay.
that's just not so nice.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine that it wasn't anything pleasant. But finally, you've managed to
Yay!
overcome that. You had two weddings, which sounds quite cool. Yeah, apart from the financial part, maybe. But otherwise, it sounds really, really nice. And well, just to wrap up our discussion today, what would be your advice to other cross-cultural or interfaith couples, maybe similar to you, when one person has a European background and the other one is from Asia, because the cultures are very different, let's face it. What would be your advice for that kind of couples if they struggle with anything in their marriage or a relationship, if they are not yet married?
Yeah, I think there are two tips. So the first one, most important, it took us too long, so that's why I share this. Drop your ego, drop your cultural ego, and really try to understand where the person is coming from, what background it might have. Maybe I can give one example with Corona or with COVID. My husband is extremely careful, like extremely careful. I'm a little bit less careful. I'm still careful, but I'm a little bit less careful. Like, I don't sanitize everything that comes into our house, for example. He does. In the
Mhm.
beginning, I got so annoyed by this, and I thought, like, oh my God, I mean, this is too much. Every apple, really? But then I realized, I grew up in a healthcare system. When I'm sick, I go to the hospital and I come out fine. He grew up in an environment, if someone's sick, he might die. You don't know if you have the necessary means to treat someone. That is kind of one of the examples, which is really important to not just jump to a conclusion because this is the way that you know it, and really understanding, okay, where is he coming from and why might he or she react the way that she does? What is the background? That helps a lot.
I think that it's very important what you've mentioned, because the first thing is, if you have a partner or a husband from a completely different culture, different country, because that's also the issue usually, from a completely different continent, there are lots of other things that you don't pay attention to. It's exactly about being open to other people's experience and also other people's circumstances in which they live earlier. So that's one of the important things in that kind of marriages or relationships, where people come from a completely different background, and at the first glance at least they don't really share that many things, which is not always the truth. Anything else that you would also mention?
Yeah, I think the second point that I would say, like apart from that, dropping the ego, I think is really important, because I mentioned that before, especially like Western cultures, we tend to look down to other cultures, or some people do. And I think it's hugely inappropriate. That is one of the points. But the second one that I wanted to make is try to find people who are also in intercultural relationships, even if they are not from the same country. I mean, it's great if you have someone with the same country, you can discuss like exactly the things that you're experiencing. But even with others, a lot of people go to similar issues. Just to Sometimes you just have to bitch. Sometimes you just have to, yeah, let steam off. And it's great if you have someone who somehow gets it. So I think this would be the second point. It's not as important as the first one, but it definitely helps in moments where you need someone to talk.
Yes, it is very helpful, because it's about having support network. And as you said, it's if it's a couple that is also of mixed background, then it's much easier, because if you talk to couples that are German, in your case, they probably don't really understand what you're going through, and their perspective is, of course, derived from their German background, so they wouldn't necessarily be that helpful to you
Yeah, exactly.
to give advice or to help you overcome it. Right. Well, thank you very much for this talk today, and it was very interesting and also educative. Thank you very much for being here, and to everyone that is listening. With this episode, we are wrapping our season 1 of the Love Talks. But stay tuned for the season 2, which will be coming at the end of January. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for having me.